Hello everyone, today we talk about Vandal warfare. The Vandals were one of the first videos that I ever made, titled just like that, The Shining Wonders of the Migration Era, for my in fact, Migration Era Peoples series. As I was explaining in my recent video about early Frankish warfare, after several years, even though I haven't finished the whole set of Migration Era Peoples, at least the major ones I did, I'm passing to their military history. And of course, as time goes by, we're also going to talk about them in sort of further detail. Especially if you have subscribed in the last several months, you have probably gotten a slightly different phase from the one of the previous period, where most of the content comes from. Well, probably you subscribed, in fact, mostly from that in any case. But for example, for the Goths, we already made lots of videos about sort of more in-depth things like specific thematic topics, some original series episodes, etc. The Vandals are an underrated Romano-Germanic people, not just because it was wiped out relatively early, at least by, in fact, that era standards, but because it was also obviously stigmatized as, in this sense, both like a bad and a sort of losing actor in history. But it's story is incredibly fascinating. It's probably the most, let's say, the most enigmatic to an extent, because again, more or less about the Goths, we have, I don't know, Cassiodorus, but we have a literature, right? The Visigoths went on. Even the fall of the Italian ones it was fairly well documented by the Byzantines. And the Franks had sort of a glorious history. Even the Burgundians sort of remained more or less distinct, even though they weren't as powerful as their northern neighbors. The Longobards, of course, founded basically the Italic kingdom. There is a lot, really, for not talking about the Anglo-Saxons, of course, but I don't have to repeat myself about this. So I hope that with this video about sort of Vandalic warfare, we can appreciate certain aspects of their culture, of their identity that I think is quite important in this big mosaic. All right, consider that Africa itself was lost to the Arabs, so that even if the Byzantines had de facto destroyed the Vandals as a people, had probably North Africa remained Christian, had remained integrated into some sort of broader Western orbit, as it had been done during the Roman Empire and the same Vandalic era, we would have known more about the Vandals. And that's, in fact, something you want to appreciate also in terms of historical, civil development of peoples, like how do we know history from which places and so on. So the Vandals were an East Germanic tribe. Right, we're actually very deeply connected with some Elb German ones, such as the Longobards. By talking about the latter, we addressed Vinil, Vandil, the Germanic Dioscuri, kind of. And there is a lot we should sort of get into in terms also of the early mythology of these people that we know mostly from also later traditions, and in fact about Vandals, not so much. We know very much about the Longobards. And these were some, by the way, of the earliest Germanic peoples that we know of, most of which were either wiped out and or changed name. I mean, the Franks, the Alemanni did not exist at this point, at least during the very beginning. And you see these peoples also took different paths. The Vandals were true globe-trotters, or at least, Mediterranean Europe trotters, so to say. Their origins are notoriously as archaeologically linked to the Przeworsk culture, as an Iron Age material culture centered in modern-day Poland, associated with cremation burials, warrior elites, and settlements in the Upper Vistula and other river basins. This horizon probably formed a significant component of the broader Lugian Confederation. This was a loose tribal alliance described by ancient Roman authors such as Strabo, Tacitus, and Ptolemy, in association with related groups including the Burgundians, that were East Germans, and the Gutones, the early Goths at least, and I made a video about, of course, these groups. We shall focus perhaps a bit more on the Grautungi, the Tervingi, rather than sort of the whole story. We already covered the whole thing, but it's interesting also to look at this earlier phase. We talk also about the Geats that remained in Scandinavia. And so there are lots of terminological, ethnographic, and genetic, let's say, ambiguities, but as you know, if you have followed my videos about Germanic history, I'm one of those proponents of the fact that even for the East Germans that were objectively the most blended peoples, especially with the Iranians of the East, all information available does suggest that their core was properly a North Scandinavian one, right? And that remained also the core of their the identity well after this sort of Odysseys, this peripacies. Now, by the 2nd century AD, right, distinct subgroups from the Lugian Confederacy had emerged. By the way, I would like to point out that as far as the ethnogenesis of these people, think that culturally we're talking about a blend of Celtic, Germanic, and even especially in the case of the Vandals, Proto-Slavic peoples. All right, we could make a deeper history of the various sort of Tacitus Germanic tribes to be looking at the few we know for some of them, but for the Lugi, as we've seen also in the video about the Ulfenar, there is actually a pretty interesting sort of anthropological information to describe their military practice as a community and their same political identity. We have here, in fact, documented in this broader confederacy, the Asdingi, who would later become the dominant branch of the Vandals, the Silingi. These Vandals first attracted sustained Roman attention during the Marcomannic Wars. As you know, a series of clashes from 166-180. Shall make a video about that soon, by the way, between Rome under Emperor Marcus Aurelius and various Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier, when in fact the Asdingi, led by kings Raus and Raptus, entered into a temporary alliance with the same Emperor Marcus Aurelius, interestingly enough. Consider the Longobards, for example, their twins were sort of along the Quadi, the Marcomanni, against Rome, and also suffered a heavy defeat at that point, whereby they sort of disappeared from history up to the sort of late antiquity, probably the late 5th century, as we've seen in our videos about the Longobards. And that also gives us sort of a geographical dimension of how and sort of where the Vandals would they would interact with Rome and other tribes, against whom in fact they came fighting on behalf of the Romans before embarking on southward migrations into Dacia, the same Roman province roughly corresponding to modern Romania. So they, of course, were in aggressive relations with the Romans, depending on the situation. Besides, there was plenty of war bands that went around, so different groups, as we've seen. So we're also in an age in which these Germans do not sort of, the Marcomannic Wars are a bit the consequence of that, the stabilization of Central Europe that would engineer that most of the biggest changes of the later century. But in fact, the Vandals are not, the Goths. They do not also coalesce here into sort of particularly robust groups. And we have to wait, in fact, around the 4th century to have more news about them. In fact, around the year 330, Emperor Constantine the Great formally granted the Vandals permissions to settle in Pannonia. The direction was more or less always the same, across the Danube in the Barbaricum, but say between the Middle Danube, the Carpathians, and further north, basically also in today's Poland. Pannonia was, as you know, the Roman province along the right bank of the Danube, encompassing parts of modern Hungary, Austria, and neighboring regions. A territory held for more than 60 years by the Vandals, amid ever-shifting alliances with the empire, however, until, in fact, more troublesome as mounting pressures from Gothic expansions to their rear, and especially Hunnic incursions from the east, compelled a renewed and decisive westward displacement in the opening and fatal years of the 5th century. Right, that's where we encounter the Vandals more directly, and especially within the lands of the empire, in a more aggressive sense. In 401-402, the Vandals raided the province of Raetia. Raetia, say at this point, say we're in the 5th century, we can switch to Ecclesiastica. Raetia was the Roman. I also made a video about that, by the way, from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages, if you're interested in it. Alpine Raetia and Alemannia as well. Raetia was this province in the Alps, covering parts of modern Switzerland, southern Germany, and western Austria as well. Soon thereafter, the Vandals participated in the massive barbarian crossing of the frozen Rhine on December 31st, 406. This is the sort of atmospheric, really, setting, environment. Actually, probably the crossing was much more organized logistically and so on, but this is probably the moment in which Vandals enter to make, as we'll see now, important damage, at least until they would settle in Africa. That at that point they did not sort of damage more than much. On the contrary, this movement across the Rhine famously happened alongside the Suebi, another Germanic tribe. This was part of the older confederacy that had sort of hegemonized most of the Germanic world, and in fact the same areas where the Vandals had lived. Part of these would also go as far as Galicia, following as the Vandals in the islands, and nomadic Iranian people from the steppes, the Gallic and the Pyrenean breakthrough. We've seen recently in the video about early Frankish warfare how fundamentally some Germanic federati in Gaul had tried to stem this human tide, but the Vandals passed through. By the way, they also had given a beating to the Burgundians, and in fact for this reason were not a particularly powerful Germanic people since the beginning. They also remained a bit in between on the same Rhine where they were eventually destroyed Worms, according to the fact of historical reconstruction of what the Nibelungenlied would basically mask behind the history of Vienna. Those were mostly the Huns of Aetius, likely, that sort of ravaged their kingdom and brought them to be deported to Sepaudia. Now, under King Godegisel, father of the later kings Gunderic and Gaiseric, by the way, the Vandals ravaged the provinces of Gaul. They entered, and at large, Roman defenses were overrun, or at least there was no way to stop these guys crossing the countryside. I recently made a video about the Gallo-Roman fortified civitates of this era that were really imposing. Like Gaul had very robust Roman cities, and especially the walls, the defenses. These Germans were not yet, especially after having come out of the Barbaricum just in the moment particular, they didn't have a statile base to begin with, but not much, even many point de vue. Their logistics were primitive. This is something that the Goths also experienced against, for example, the walls of Constantinople. In any case, the Vandals at this point, probably, they didn't even yet know in the moment where to go settle. That's something evolving along the way. They had sustained heavy casualties in fierce clashes with Franks, the federated Germanic allies of Rome that we were talking about before, near the river Rhine. In fact, casualties that included Godegisel himself, before continuing at that point, realizing that that was a bit of a sort of, also not much of a worth land to die for. The greatest riches and fortunes were in the south. In fact, continuing toward that direction through Aquitaine, southwestern Gaul, under the leadership of Godegisel's son Gunderic. That's where the Vandals, and especially in Spain, as we'll see now, will earn a bad name because of the ravages, the destructions. Most of that idea of the Vandals, again, as destroyers, actually derives from not even much just the Vandal sack of Rome, but the fact that they were Aryans and they were, in that sense, from Africa later, uncompromising, sort of a threat for Italy, etc. So they weren't actually particularly worse than any other Germanic people. They naturally were a threat. They were, at this point, destroying and looting because they realized that they were not to stay there in these various places for long. Very different behavior from the one they would exhibit when they would settle into Africa. There was a jewel, really, and especially extremely profitable for their standards. They would settle into Africa, and they would, in fact, Crossing the Pyrenees in October 409, the Vandals entered the Iberian Peninsula, where Roman authorities initially recognized them as federati, so, as you know, allied barbarian settlers granted land in exchange for military service and allocated lands. Right? It was also an attempt historically to stop, like from the Hispano-Roman side, these invasions at the Pyrenees, but resistance was too fragmented. It was mostly like local oligarchs and clans that tried to oppose such large groups. Also, they could have, in theory, stopped them, but they were not sufficiently backed politically or military from at this point Ravenna and or also other parts of Spain that had began, in fact, sort of to drift a bit sort of different directions. The Astingi received northwestern Galicia, modern Galicia and northern Portugal, the Silingi southern Betic and modern Andalusia in southern Spain, while the Alans that had been Vandalic allies at that point, territories in Lusitania, so in modern central Portugal and the region around Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena. I made a couple of videos about the Alans, or even more than that, and we've seen what kind of impact they left in the West, even though they were a small, fragmented people. Their elite knights were basically the models of the later medieval ones in many ways, and they had a picked role that often also opposed the same Germanic groups with which they had poured in. The Romans used them as a bit as the tip of the balance, particularly in Gaul, right, as a mobile reserve of heavily armored cavalrymen to intervene here and there against different internal and external enemies. You understand that this settlement was brokered with the locals that tried to equally partition like the various lands where this Germanic tribes were allocated. Normally, this had already happened, by the way, with the Goths in particular that had been straddling. In fact, both sides of the Pyrenees were mostly in Aquitaine, and there was not enough space there. Also for the Vandals. The point being essentially substituting this more warlike peoples to the lacking Roman army, right? So installing them as military colonists, serving them logistically and with supplies from the local annona, mostly nature at this point. But the far west of Rome was at this point severely shattered. The Iberian Peninsula was rich but divided, an enormous territory, as you know. We will not here look at properly at the Vandal settlement pattern, also because it's not overwhelmingly documented. In any case, imperial policy soon shifted towards containment of these groups rather than sort of further facilitation. I mean, they had literally broken through, as we've seen in the previous decade. This had been really a big problem overall. There were entire groups, just like the Visigoths, that in fact the same Emperor Honorius dispatched in 418 to turning, in fact, the same Visigoths against the Silingi Vandals, who were annihilated, or nearly annihilated, in the process. The same goes for the Alans of Spain. The battered survivors submitted to Gunderic at this point, and that's how the Asdingians became prevalent, the dominating group. Gunderic unified command over this entire group, essentially the Asdingi, what remained of the others, and rapidly extended dominion into Baetica after repulsing a Roman Suebic coalition in 419. The Suebi had, as we said before, also settled in Spain, were part of the original crossing, but they were not such a powerful group like the one that the Vandals altogether had. So they were not even a confederacy, they were just sort of kin, right? And therefore they stuck together. But as we've seen, they also settled in a relatively disorderly fashion. It was really typical of barbarians just arrived, unless they were under particular immediate pressure and or they were better controlled, say from like in the Goths in the Balkans, from Constantinople. And the same Suebic, by the way, had been settling in Roman Spain. It would later be absorbed, as you know, by the Visigoths. The Romano-Suebic coalition in 419 was repelled by the Vandals. Again, bear in mind that here, even though these are thickly compact, warlike peoples that constitute probably an exercitus, so people in arms on their own, there's a lot of the local Hispano-Roman establishment that is very rich, by the way. In Spain, in spite of also all these troubles, the latifundium will not die. This is the same case for Gaul, right? And so this was a struggle for the Iberian Peninsula, and there is a crushing defeat inflicted by the Vandals, finally, in fact, to the patrician Castinus' combined army in 422. A victory almost certainly facilitated by substantial defections from disillusioned Roman ranks at this point. It said, okay, well, it's better maybe to be under these guys at this point than continuing this protracted warfare. As you know, even 2 generations later, the Italian army was able to come back to Spain and to have the Visigoths surrender. And as we will see, you know, what happened. The Vandals stood in between from Africa. Gunduric's abrupt death in 428, occurring while he was besieging a church in Seville, brought his half-brother Gaiseric, also spelled Gensericus in Latin, an illegitimate son of Godegisel, renowned for his strategic brilliance and ruthlessness. You can argue that after, well, there are lots of great Romano-Germanic leaders of this era. If you look at Clovis, first of all, but historically Alaric, that had been the monarch for all, Theodoric, Dietrich von Bern, Theodoric the Great of Verona, so to say, that these were all sung in the sagas for a long time to come, just like Albelin for the Longobards. But Gaiseric was really one of the single greatest Germanic leaders of this era, and he single-handedly acted as the tip of the balance that ultimately did not allow the Western Roman Empire to re-extend over, in fact, most of the Western Mediterranean because of the Battle of Cape Bon. And so most of sort of Vandalic glory actually shines under Gaiseric, right? The shining one, in fact, that's what Vindil also has to do with. Gaiseric, as we've seen here, was an illegitimate son that rose to the throne, and his exceptionally energetic and ruthless leadership swiftly transformed the Vandals into a formidable Mediterranean naval power through the systematic capture of key ports such as Cartagena. So we're still in Spain, huh? And so you have immediately that sort of naval proclivity of the Vandals, we will see now, in their mostly, admittedly, piratical activity, but still crippling ones as far as especially the connections between Africa and Spain and Italy was concerned. There was very much the lifeline also for the Italian army, as we said before. This capture of Cartagena enabled wide-ranging raids on the Balearic Islands, Mauritania, so the still Roman provinces in modern Morocco and Algeria. Now that those will formally at least sort of outlive the same western half of the empire, 476. Also Sicily already, before the entire Vandalic people undertook their complete translocation in May 429. And right as you were there, you could plunder a little bit across Spain. Now, this new migration from the Iberian Peninsula encompassed reportedly some 80,000 individuals in total, yielding a capable fighting strength estimated between 15,000 and 20,000 warriors. There is a potent demographic aspect about this, because when you look at the Germanic peoples that settled in the West, you realize that there were really a staunch minority, to say the least. Each of the Western Roman provinces, especially on the European continent, counted millions of inhabitants. And when you look at, realistically, in fact, just very few tens of thousands of warriors, you realize that even one wrong battle could essentially wipe out these people. And it had already happened to some groups here and there. We also documented some of them, in fact, in their gradual sort of attritional dissolution, especially the smaller groups, admittedly. But even the Visigoths at some point could be simply taken out. Like the largest migrations were the ones of the Ostrogoths, of the Longobards, for different reasons. Here, the Vandals were really still, walking on edge, and they will actually continue doing so, given sort of the trouble that they caused to Rome and the quite sort of bad situations they got themselves into. The risk reward, admittedly, were very successful at the point, as we will see now. This migration occurred in the following way. The Vandals crossed the Straits of Gibraltar amid the ongoing rebellion of the Roman Comes Africae, famously enough the military governor of Africa, Bonifacius, against authorities in the Western Empire, quite possibly at his direct invitation as a sought-after military ally at some point. Upon landing in Mauritania, Tingitana, the westernmost Roman North Africa, so on the Atlantic, northern Morocco, Geiseric's advancing columns moved relentlessly eastward, inflicting devastation on a scale that contemporary eyewitnesses such as Posidius, Bishop of Calama, recorded in vivid and harrowing detail. Systematic looting, murders, tortures, and burnings that spared neither age, nor sex, nor even the clergy, of course, while churches and their sacred ornaments were desecrated or destroyed. Naturally, we will talk about this because great part of the vandalism attributed to the Vandals exactly stems from these episodes that are somehow described in this way for obvious reasons. It's not like these things did not happen, right? Or there's a conspiracy theory about the devastations of the Germans, that their barbarism, whatever. This was, generally speaking, functional to their political and strategical goals. Some terrorism at large serves the purpose of facilitating even the arrival. They were plundering along the way, as we explained before, also for quite practical reasons. It's naturally difficult to profile the sort of the political cohesion of these groups, what kind of orders they obeyed to. They were mostly following this single sort of unitary leaders in that traditional fashion of this is a great commander. He's a sacred ruler in the moment in which he receives the imperium in order to carry out these things. But say once we settle down, we will have been elevated ourselves to the degree by which we will return. In fact, as we will see in the later Vandalic clashes within themselves, to some more egalitarian balance equilibrium. This guy's just a primus inter pares, etc. Other complicated thing is what kind of beliefs the Vandals held. If you know Schwerpunkt, you know that there was actually only one religion for everybody involved. Christians, non-Christians, Romans, Germans, they all basically believed in the same thing. As far as the formal Christianity of some Vandals, there were surely many Arians. Surely there would have been some Catholic. Likely the majority was more, even just by identity reason, because this is fairly early in time, by the way. It's after the Rhine crossings. And so just one generation that had come out of the Barbaricum, still largely pre-Christian, right? They were much into sort of Woden, and they understood, of course, that it was the same identical thing of Jupiter or the Christian god. There was only one Sky Father, all right? And they, however, had just different cultural, moral ways to decline that. They were not very tender-hearted, this is for sure, but this was also just a very cruel world to begin with. In May or June 430, near Calama itself, so from the place of the prelate that was describing their distractions, the Vandals confronted Bonifacius, who had by this point reconciled with Ravenna and emerged victorious through markedly superior strategic maneuvering, despite facing a composite Roman field army that had been reinforced by Gothic Bucellari. compelling the defeated Romans to withdraw behind the protection of fortified cities. So this was basically a Roman civil war. The Bucellari were essentially some retinue soldiers that were largely paid through, as we have seen also in Spain, private funds, like the local magnates, oligarchs. There were lots of Goths in the empire at this point that functioned pretty well as soldiers. And so you see Romans and Germans from both sides in all these clashes, whether internally between the Romans or between the Romans or a Germanic or Iranian group, Germano-Iranian group like the Vandals. I made some videos, by the way, about Irano-Germanic warfare in general, including the one on sacred swords and so on. Naturally, the Vandals had a pinch of that steppe flavor, especially with the Alans among them, but they surely also in their East Germanic war would have received, they would have had some sort of closer proximity. In spite of his victory, and because the Vandals were now arriving, Bonifacius entrenched himself at Hipporegius, modern Annaba, Algeria, major coastal city and ecclesiastical center, where the Vandals imposed a prolonged and grinding siege beginning in mid-430. During this investment, St. Augustine, famously enough, like the father of the church and bishop of Hippo, perished. Right, so this is properly apocalyptic scenario. We are on August the 28th, 430. The combined effects of famine and physical strain was too much for the influential theologian, and the blockade enforced by Gaiseric endured until Eastern Roman reinforcements under Aspar, another barbarian general, arrived in 431, at which point Gaiseric chose to lift the siege. These were important centers, right? Roman Africa was one of the most radically urbanized, prosper, and developed parts of the West. Again, as we said before, it almost pains you what kind of divide historically unfolded from also not even too far away times from these onwards. So the Vandals back down, right? At a point, the combination of Roman army and city walls are a bit too much at a time. It was better to be prudent. However, renewed and intensified campaigning for 432 saw Gaiseric overwhelm the joint Roman forces commanded by Bonifacius and Aspar, thereby enabling the unopposed capture of Hipporegius, which served briefly as the Vandal capital. In fact, before a treaty concluded in 435 granted them formal control over Mauretania and the western half of Numidia, the fertile inland province in modern Algeria. So we are basically like in the sort of northwest, sort of western part of northwest Africa. And that was an important settlement, but obviously the Vandals were vying for the most developed part of Africa, namely Carthage. That was not very far away. Gaiseric deliberately violated this treaty in 439 by seizing Carthage. And so the prosperous former Phoenician city and capital of Roman Africa, renowned for its harbor and wealth, commanding some of the most important choke points in the Mediterranean, commanding essentially Sicily from there, very close to Sardinia, but especially controlling from the African hinterland the granary of Italy, of Rome, just as Egypt was, for example, for Constantinople. So this was a major game changer. It's fascinating to see how provinces historically had changed. For example, Sicily at this point was sort of much less autonomous and in this sense self-defensible than Africa. There was a veritable launch pad for now a proactive people that had reinforced, in fact, the local military through their own exercitus and could take action at sea. Gaiseric seized Carthage on October the 19th, 439, without meeting any resistance, as the majority of its inhabitants were absorbed in spectacle, allegedly at the hippodrome. the political climate, obviously, especially after the Vandal military victory, had dramatically changed in favor of Gaiseric, that in any case was seizing all the key strategic strongholds in the region. This bloodless conquest secured the wealthiest core provinces of Zeugitana, also called Africa Proconsularis, the heartland around Carthage, that is, and Byzacena in the south, in fact, southern Tunisia roughly, today, permitting Gaiseric to proclaim a fully independent kingdom of the Vandals and Alans. That's what you want to appreciate, to have the given the right due to the devil, the Alans, of course, as it was a shared venture enterprise, complete with sovereign coinage that, however, emphatically asserted not just Gaiseric's authority, but also the separation from the imperial one. So definitely at that point, of course, that was a bit obvious, right? When you look at these Germanic peoples, you realize they all had different attitudes towards Rome, or at least they had some kind of common traits or conditions, properly, that brought them to definitely both fight or against or for the Romans. This is true for all of them, but that were naturally a bit more conditioned by the general situation. For example, the Franks and the Alemanni. How much do they differ? Basically, like, they were almost the same people. All right, they were at least incredibly similar, but their position on the map makes them, sort of, the Franks less threatening to the Romans, the Alemanni more threatening to the Romans, closer to the Alps. Obviously, Rome allies itself with the Franks. Geopolitics, again, does not exist. There are so many different intersections that we've just seen. The Vandals, by holding Africa, were becoming sworn enemies of Ravenna, of Rome, of Italy, because, as we explained, they were not essentially exporting any more grain to reinforce, in fact, the Italian Annona and the, especially in central and southern Italy, the bulk of an Italian army supply system. That will actually continue for a couple of generations. In fact, again, Majorianus was to reconquer Spain, hadn't the Vandals gotten in between. And that's where Gaiseric, you realize, was just like a giant in sort of migration era warfare and politics. And so, in any case, you have to be an enemy of Rome. It's a bit different from the Visigoths, who just wanted a place far away because they had finally gotten it in the west and they could rule on behalf of Rome. Similarly, the Franks, etc. The Vandals had to be enemies of Rome. Hence, also the Black Legend about them, the fact that they were just a bunch of looters, destroyers. Actually, we do not have much evidence whatsoever that Africa was poorly ruled by the Vandals. This is valid for any Germanic people. Whenever they settled into Roman land, they tried as much as they could to preserve everything that was standing, stayed their own people in arms, as properly supplied by the Roman military system, and much else, including the fact that even though they were Arians officially, which was already some sort of, it's bigger than a political contingency, but it was already in the temper, but it was just a way to align a bit more with Roman tastes and the Romanity of these lands. Catholics were left untouched. There is very scarce evidence of Vandalic destruction, violence. It wouldn't make any sense. All the Germans that settled Roman land, in that land, unlike as we've seen in the case of the Vandals in Spain, in West Africa, etc., they did not loot and plunder. They wanted to maintain as much as they could intact and functional under properly the Roman system. From the rapidly rejuvenated harbor of Carthage, that, as you know, has the ancient colony, has a very specific shape, as you can observe still today, the Vandals constructed a powerful fleet that soon asserted unchallenged dominance over the western Mediterranean. There wasn't any greater power especially provided with enough reasons to venture navally out there, or even the resources. The Vandals, in this sense, were, I mean, Italy was richer and more developed, but they had this greater opportunity of investing their resources in a more piratical direction. Also because even though Africa was pretty rich in the hinterland, it was still limited, unavoidably connected with the rest, sort of the civilized world across the Straits, Sicily, Italy, and so on. Thus, the best option was really to follow on the sort of the footsteps of the Phoenicians, so to say, from that position, because North Africa is, in any case, dramatically incapable of yielding the demographic resources for any sort of expansion, any meaningful conquest of the northern Mediterranean. Especially at this point, by the way, later you would think the Arabs would do that with Spain, but that's a bit of a different story, and it's also mostly due to internal political issues in Spain rather than even this overwhelming invading force of admittedly Berbers with an Arabized elite at that point. The Vandals also use lots of Berbers. That they were also their enemies, telling the truth, because some of these Vandals would all that there is all a pattern of settlement that maintains some frontier garrisons that at some point will be left there by the Byzantines after Belisarius destroyed the Vandals. But also there were auxiliaries, and technically in the West, still a Roman government going. That's at least a local government that still made things work a bit like it was in better times. The Vandals succeeded in systematically incorporating Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, this is Carthage reborn really, and intermittently, in fact, portions of western Sicily, while launching pervasive and far-reaching raids that extended as far as the Aegean Sea and the coasts of Greece itself. Right, this is a bit the panorama of the situation, with mostly naval activities. Roman efforts to counter this dramatic Vandal expansion proved consistently inadequate during the kingdom's early decades. An eastern expedition dispatched under Aspar in 431 accomplished little beyond providing temporary relief to besieged cities, as we've seen before, while Western Emperor Majorian's meticulous prepared fleet in 460, assembled in Spanish harbors with the explicit intention of invasion, was entirely destroyed by Vandal sabotage and paid treachery before it could even set sail. Right? This would have actually reconquered Spain. There is sort of strong historiographical consensus on the fact that the Goths were to surrender and to simply be deported on other parts of the Roman frontier. Gaiseric stands in between, and he succeeds, by the way, after an incredibly long reign, right, to single-handedly destroy, essentially, the Roman attempts at reconquest. This guy lived a very long time, right, 389, roughly, 477 AD. You can argue that after his death, the Vandal decline started. It's rightful to sort of speculate that had there been another Vandal king with less sort of iron fist, but that's true also for the expedition we will see now at Cape Bon in particular, because that's where the Eastern Romans at that point came to knock at the African doors. The Vandals would have already been destroyed, and likely the Western Roman Empire would have properly received at some point the Islamic invasions when they happened, right? And there was nothing particular about sort of the end of the West encompassing on the picture. Maybe the Islamic invasions would have neither happened for some reason. The most ambitious and costly Roman counterstroke came in 468, famously enough, we just said it, when Eastern Emperor Leo I and Western Emperor Anthemius coordinated mounted a joint operation of unprecedented scale. More than 1,113 ships transporting tens of thousands of troops under the overall command of Basiliscus, that was Leo's brother-in-law, carefully coordinated with separate forces under Marcellinus that successfully retook Sardinia at that point, and under Heraclius that advanced from Tripolitania towards Carthage, so passing essentially via land like the Libyan coastland, Tripolitanian coastland if you prefer. The interesting aspect of this is not just the fact that this expedition was literally to wipe out the Vandals in hindsight, because these forces were vastly superior, not much in quantity but in quality to the Vandal ones. The fact that still the West and the East were cooperating to restore a Mediterranean unity. I mean, had Africa had been reconquered at that point, the Easterners would have given it back to it to the Westerners, right? There would have not been, okay, like now we seize it. There had been similar issues, telling the truth, in Illyricum, but that was a sort of more ambiguous area in general. The Eastern Roman Empire was more powerful. Initial successes were so promising for the Romans. Again, Sardinia was reclaimed with minimal opposition, and Heraclius encountered little resistance in Libya, but the main fleet under Basiliscus anchored imprudently off Cape Bon, the ancient Promontorium Mercurii, by the way, which is a sort of very interesting, also theological reference, because Mercury is in that sense representing the Holy Ghost to a degree. And Gaiseric requested a 5-day armistice, ostensibly for negotiations. The Romans thought that they had crushed him, that he would essentially break, like he would subject himself to Rome. But during this pause, he prepared numerous fireships and launched under favorable winds, which you need sort of skill to exploit, but especially a lot of luck to have, in a surprise night attack. These devastated the tightly clustered Roman armada, burning or sinking roughly half the vessels and scattering the remainder in a catastrophe that rapidly drained the Eastern Empire's treasuries and effectively foreclosed any realistic Western prospect of recovering Africa's indispensable grain revenues and tax base. Gaiseric pulled off this major feat. There is in fact, Eastern Roman policy of fleet rebuilding that will culminate only, in fact, paradoxically, in the same Justinian end reconquest with Belisarius' conquest of the Vandals, only generations later. I made videos both about Leo, we talked about Anastasius, we talked about, in fact, the same Justinian. We covered sort of Byzantine history fairly, not necessarily in depth, but pretty continuously, even eventually, manualistically, so to say, to make you see that perspective. We talk also about their strategy in general. Naturally, having a fleet cost a lot. At this point, only the East had something pretty substantial, like the one that mostly carried out, in fact, operations at Cape Bon. But you want to appreciate here the Vandal amphibious capability. The fact that they knew their deal, they knew the coast, the winds. They had a sort of rough but technically successful set of fireships that really achieved the final objective of destroying the Roman fleet. This was an extraordinary victory that owes much to Gaiseric's will to power, because in those circumstances you're just like a midget crushed by a giant. In Clausewitzianly speaking, this is the moment in which everything goes dark. You're basically given up, and Gaiseric had this massive sense of the necessity, of the imperative, really, that was required to defeat his opponents. Gaiseric had attained the absolute pinnacle of his power in 455, shrewdly exploiting Petronius Maximus's violent usurpation and assassination of Valentinian III. This was the moment in which he held more sway over sort of Western Mediterranean. The reason why these issues at the Rabbinate court had happened because of the emperor's invalidation previously arranged the betrothal agreements. Gaiseric at this point directed his fleet against the city of Rome itself. Right, this is the high point of Vandal strategic projection. In fact, upon landing at the port, and following the personal intercession of Pope Leo I, who negotiated to spare the population from massacre and arson, the Vandals occupied Rome for 2 weeks. Right, this is the second sacker, the most of the migration era. This is actually worse than the Visigothic one that was sort of milder. There were distractions there too, but they were contained, and Alaric there was in a more precarious situation. At this point, essentially the Italian army is not intervening for different reasons, and the general collapse of the sort of local rule. The Vandals conducted a methodical and systematic plunder of palaces and temples. Most of the greatest treasures that Rome had collected through her millenary history at this point were properly confiscated. The Vandals brought them to Africa. There were lots of beautiful legions, including, for example, the Jewish menorah, taken home by the Romans from the temple of Jerusalem, would have been brought to Carthage. And when Belisarius conquered Carthage, they're just legions. It said that Justinian had it brought back to Jerusalem, as a matter of fact. During the Vandalic sack of Rome, that I made a video on, where you have all these sort of legions. There are sort of very interesting stories connected to that. The Germans stripped the gilded bronze even from the roof of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus and the Capitoline Hill. This was one of the most painful and really terrible days in the history of Rome and the West. They carried away the Empress Licina Eudoxia, her daughters Eudocia and Placidia, immense quantities of movable wealth and sacred relics, including the golden menorah that we said before, and other treasures from the second temple that Titus had brought to Rome centuries earlier. Gaiseric died in January 477 at a very advanced age, as we've seen, having instituted a law of succession by the eldest male of the royal house. His son Huneric inherited the throne and promptly intensified Arian, that is to say, non-Trinitarian Christian sect considered heretical by the Nicene majority, persecutions. At least we know they happened in the form of substitution of prelates. Right, they exiled bishops and confiscated church properties in a manner that, in particular, severely strained relations with Constantinople, also because the year prior, the western half of the empire had basically returned the insignia under Odoacer to the same Constantinople. So at this point, the Vandals feel like there is always a threat, like there is always the eastern part of the empire that is by far the greatest power and can actually strip them of their fundamentally provincial power, because aside from Africa, it's not like they had truly conquered other lands. Like even Sicily, Sardinia, the Balearic Islands, it was mostly just a coastal control, piratic activity, like profiting from the tolls from the general control of the straits, right? But they were essentially a provincial power. The Arian Catholic struggle would actually arise also within the same Vandal aristocracy, because there was part of the establishment that was more prone to sort of tie with the Roman nobility, locally others that thought instead that they could and would keep what they had gained from the previous generation just in their hands. This is a very similar problem that brought a lot of political instability, ultimately the downfall of the same Vandals. But we can't see even among the Visigoths, for example, the same Ostrogoths later on. It was a great issue. We'll see better now. Subsequent rulers such as Guntamund and Trasamund adopted more intermittent policies of tolerance amid a perceptible gradual decline in Vandals' martial vigor. as the warrior class increasingly adopted a luxurious lifestyle amid Africa's abundant riches while simultaneously facing intensifying pressure from independent Berber polities emerging in the interior Aures Mountains and the Altaba region. All in all, they were not faring poorly, right? Even this decline in military standards is not much sort of technical in nature. Even if they were even better equipped, now they had also the full control of local production, system administration, supply lines, and so on. So they paradoxically were better than when they had arrived. But again, political divide among the same Vandal elite was always the same problem. And there's nothing more sort of attractive for predators than a politically divided but also very rich place. Hilderic's ascension in 523 signaled a pronounced rapprochement with the Eastern Empire. He immediately seized persecutions of Chalcedonian Christians, initiated regular exchanges of embassies and gifts with Justinian, even prior to the latter's sole rule, by the way, and replaced his own portrait on royal coinage with that of the emperor, like still many de facto autonomous, if not independent, Germanic powers used to do, which was not just, as evidently in this case, a matter of sort of trying to copy, like trying to validate more your own currency by dispatching it for the Constantinopolitan one that was naturally more reliable. All these actions clearly reflected hope of eventual peaceful subordination, because it was understood that the Byzantines basically had a renewed naval force, and it was better sort of to be good with them to have some condition of power sharing rather than full-out war. However, Hilderic's notably pacific character and repeated defeats inflicted by Berber tribes in Byzacena, there was this constant guerrilla in the outskirts of the Roman world, aroused fierce opposition among the Vandal nobility. This guy was essentially pro-Catholic. He was not functioning properly as a ruler. This all led to a palace coup in 530 that overthrew Hilderic, imprisoning him and his relatives, and later executing him, installing his cousin Gelimer on the throne, and thereby furnishing Justinian, having only just secured the eternal peace with Persia. That's where we want to be worried in the West. We are in 532. All this was also perfectly legitimate casus belli for direct Byzantine intervention in African affairs. Gelimer's early reign was marked by domestic purges that included executions and widespread property confiscations among perceived political rivals in the nobility, measures that seriously eroded his legitimacy and contributed directly to uprisings in peripheral provinces. That's where you can tell that the Vandal system is falling apart already. Godas, that was another Vandal leader, proclaimed independence in Sardinia, while Pudentius led a native revolt in Tripolitania. Consider that these areas had been historically and partially even Latinized. There were still, again, Roman aristocrats all over the place. There was a capacity to reconnect, especially with Constantinople, to signal the Byzantines that those areas were ready to rise against the Vandals. Both rebellions, in fact, immediately appealed to Justinian for aid in what modern scholarship recognizes as carefully coordinated Byzantine diplomatic preparation for direct intervention in the Vandal kingdom. Gelimer, that naturally was feeling the pressure at this point, the heat behind the corner, so to say, responded by committing the bulk of his naval strength that had been significantly bolstered from the time of Gaiseric, 120 of his finest vessels, in a substantial army numbering 5,000 warriors under the command of his brother Zazzo to suppress the Sardinian insurrection. A fateful decision that critically stripped mainland Africa of its most effective defenses in the moment, and also removed the fleet that had long constituted the primary deterrent to any Roman landing. The Sardinian hinterland in particular is pretty rough, so it was complicated to quell this rebellion. Again, I can't help but to think about the Carthaginian parallelisms, such as the Sardinian mercenary revolt back in the day. Ganymer deferred decisive action against the Tripolitanian revolt, by the way, due to its relative remoteness and acute manpower constraints. It's not like the Vandals had particularly increased in manpower because the local populace had been partially disarmed. Yes, there were Roman militias, etc., but the bulk was constituted by the Germans and also partly Berber auxiliaries that were aimed also at keeping the Roman populace a bit at bay. Ganymer intended to await Tsatsou's return from Sardinia before undertaking further campaigns, which was deleterious to the extent, at least, in which the initiative was yielded to the enemy, while simultaneously attempting to secure alliances, if anything, with, for example, the Visigothic king Theodes, and remaining oblivious to Ostrogothic overtures rooted in lingering resentment over earlier mistreatment of their Princess Amalafrida, widow of Trasimund. There were lots of sort of behind-the-scenes things going on. In any case, it was rather the Vandals who were uncompromising for international reasons, right? Basically, the entire Arian and pre-Christian axis in Europe, from Central Europe to, in fact, Spain, and passing through, in particular, Theodoric Italy's axis that also controlled, in fact, part of the Illyricum, etc., was against the Catholic one, the one of the Franks by this point, and Constantinople. It was already sort of projecting through its plans like the reconquest of the West, also to stem, in fact, Frankish expansionism. The Vandals could have, they had been sort of smacked by the Ostrogoths that managed to ransom Sicily, put an end basically to most of the Vandal piratic activities. That was the greatest power that felt threatened by it. But in the moment Constantinople was threatening anyone, there could have been also some more international cooperation. That did not really happen. This is when Justinian selected Belisarius, fresh from distinguished victories against the Persians and the decisive suppression of the Nika riots in Constantinople. I made a video about the latter in particular, to command the expedition. This force comprised 10,000 infantry, drawn from both regular comitatenses and federati units, because the terminology still survived from the 4th century. 5,000 cavalry. This was really the backbone of Belisarius' forces, among whom 1,500 to 2,000 were, in fact, Belisarius' personal elite bucellari, the term deriving from the sort of biscuit bread that, a bit like the same etymology of the masnata, but in later medieval times. And additional allied contingents of 600 Hunnic and 400 Herald-mounted archers. I made a video about, 2 videos about the Heruli. They were some of the most warlike, albeit sort of small, Germanic peoples, mostly dwelling at this point across the Balkans and Central Europe, also Northern Europe, when I will come back, at least what remain of them. I also made a video about the Battle of Tricamarum that describes a bit also the Hunnic relation with Belisarius. These were prisoners of war from the Balkan, essentially the Danubian theater, that were forced into, in fact, fighting for the empire in Africa against the Vandals. This force was transported on 500 vessels crewed by 30,000 sailors and escorted by 92 Roman warships. Though seemingly modest in size relative to the Vandals' long-standing martial reputation, the Byzantine army consisted of high-quality veteran troops exceptionally well-suited to the task, in stark contrast to the Vandal host, a traditional levy of all able-bodied males drawn from a population base capable of yielding perhaps 20 to 30,000 warriors. At this point, we had grown noticeably softer, however, through decades of prosperous African life. There is this myth that the Vandals at this point had been relying exclusively on lightly armored cavalry optimized solely for close quarters hand-to-hand combat and entirely neglecting the use of bows or javelins. Further weakened by the open hostility of Romano-African subjects, the persistence of a pro-Hilderic faction with their own within their own ranks, and the deeply ambivalent stance of surrounding Berber tribes preferred to observe essentially from the sidelines and rally to whichever side ultimately emerged victorious. But the technical thing is not really true. It is rather true that the Vandals actually had an elite, right, of heavily armored cavalrymen, and that most of their cavalry had become softer rather. It's not much that they didn't have javelins or they didn't know how to fight in this sense. Also with Mauryan mercenaries for that matter. However, they were a less militarily cohesive force compared to their own opponents. They lacked a bit that level of professionalism that especially like a strong state can confer to a properly collectively trained force. In that regard, the Byzantines at this point were really peaking in terms of military culture, in terms of blend of Latin practicality and Greek genius, sort of intellectual superiority. They were actually also similar forces from the outside, the ones of the enemies. The most important issue was, however, the fact that the country was politically fractured, right? And so there was not a great content regarding Vandal rule. Many subjects, including probably some Vandals, would have preferred, as we've seen before, even from some Vandal king, to come back in a more sort of subordinated relation with Constantinople. Belisarius's expeditionary fleet departed the Byzantine capital amid considerable pomp and ceremony, late June 533, progressing slowly with enforced stops at Heraclea Perinthus to embark horses and at Abydos due to prolonged calms, eventually reaching Methone in the Peloponnese, where a serious outbreak of dysentery caused by spoiled bread, apparently blamed directly on cost-cutting measures ordered by the Praetorian prefect John the Cappadocian, claimed the lives of 500 soldiers before Belisarius implemented corrective measures and the army recovered. Continuing via Zacynthus and Catania in Ostrogothic Sicily, interestingly enough, because that's going to be invaded by the Byzantines later, but initially, like, the Ostrogoths sort of let them pass and supply, were, by the way, also critically important intelligence gathered by Procopius revealed both Gelimer's temporary absence from Carthage inland at Hermione and Tsazo's ongoing commitment in Sardinia. The Byzantine armada sailed past Malta and achieved an entirely unopposed landing at Caput Vada in early September, catching Gelimer completely by surprise and allowing the Byzantines to establish a secure beachhead. Naturally, we do not know how much the Vandals were unaware of these Byzantine movements, because this was a substantial force and things are known months in advance by spies, merchants. People move, people travel, they know. However, for whichever reason, Gelimer was probably underestimating the Byzantines, did not probably expect this speed, and found himself in a disastrous situation that basically undermined the entire Vandal success right from the start. Belisarius, acutely mindful of the disastrous precedent set by the 468 expedition, and prioritizing the cultivation of active support from the Latin-speaking Romano-African population that had largely retained its Roman cultural identity, in fact. Again, this era was probably very well developed, right? And therefore, sort of sticking to probably even a Western identity. Enforced the strictest discipline from the outset, severely punishing soldiers who stole fruit from local orchards, which won, in this sense, also the populace's support. That was the main thing. And repeatedly exhorting the entire army to show restraint, in fact, towards the natives. Measures that, as Procopius, that is, as you know, Belisarius' secretary and primary historian of the campaign, is very well detailed. That's all what you can see in the video about the Battle of Tricamarum, explicitly records won such widespread allegiance that the subsequent march northwards proceeded, quote, as if in his own land. So in this sense, Africa felt like a completely Roman land, just like the rest of the empire was, not one where the Vandals were ruling. In other words, they had become extraneous and or ineffective to the point of irrelevance. Advancing along the coastal road with a vanguard of 300 horse under John the Armenian, the left flank screened by the 600 Huns and his own Bucellari guarding the rear against possible attack from Gelimer, known to be in the vicinity. While the fleet paralleled the column offshore, the Byzantines captured Selectum by ruse and attempted, though unsuccessfully, to incite defection among Vandal nobles by circulating Justinian's letter proclaiming the campaign's purpose as the restoration of the legitimate King Hilderic against the usurper Gelimer. Gelimer, upon receiving news of the landing, immediately ordered his brother Amatus to assemble available forces at Carthage, to execute Hilderic and his remaining relatives, and to prepare the royal treasure for possible flight to Spain. While he himself shadowed the Byzantine advance and meticulously prepared a decisive ambush at the 10th milestone south of Carthage, the site in fact known as Ad Decimum, referring to this distance from the city. This is the site, by the way, of the first major battle of the campaign, famously enough. It's interesting how the Vandals were planning to literally fall back on Spain had things gone wrong as they did. But they wouldn't even have much to withdraw from Africa with at that point. There is an interesting international situation here where everything is ambiguous. Everybody's realizing that the Byzantines are fully committed. They are now springing forth with their renewed thalassocracy that allows them to strategically project in ways that hadn't been unthinkable up to a generation before. Many parts of the Mediterranean really, or actually all of them, as also some parts in probably continental Europe, believed to still be within the Roman Empire. This is something that we tend to underestimate. Most of these places, in many ways, kept working, as if nothing had really been. Most of, especially Africa, it's not until the Islamic invasions that would change face really in a deep sense. There were some parts of Provence where, the Roman mints were still working, and as if they were part, probably under Constantinople, or at least as a part of the empire in that normal relational sense. The same in many ways is true for the Ostrogoths that rule in Italy on their own account, but still on behalf of the emperor in this ambiguous system. But at the consistorium of Ravenna, there are both Romans and Goths ruling jointly Italy, like the Goths as the army, the Romans as sort of civilian officials. So even Spain, that as we've seen was essentially the most fragmented of these lands, the one where political control, also historical documentation is scarcer, right, could constitute like a far western refuge for even these more this bolder Germanic vanguards right across the Mediterranean. The Vandals progressed through minor preliminary skirmishers near Grasse before Belisarius cut inland across the neck of the Cape Bon Peninsula. On the morning of September the 13th, Gelimer's carefully coordinated envelopment plan miscarried in catastrophic fashion. Amatus arrived prematurely and perished during a rash reconnaissance near Carthage. Gibamun's detached force of 2,000 intended to strike the Byzantine left flank was intercepted and utterly destroyed by the Hunnic screen. And Gelimer's main body, though initially scattering the Roman advance guards, posed the site of Amatus's corpse to lament, thereby forfeiting the crucial initiative. This is also fascinating because it shows that Vandals actually did have a mobile cavalry, that they knew essentially how to at least approximately coordinate, and they were aware, of course, of the surprise, both strategic and tactic, provided by flank rear attacks. However, here the Byzantines show a bit their best. They know how to screen, how to scout, how to intercept, how to coordinate their own army itself. So this is a masterpiece. Belisarius swiftly rallied his troops, brought up the main cavalry force, and launched a devastating countercharge that routed the now disorganized Vandals westward into Numidia. Right? That's how crushing this defeat was. Reuniting his scattered contingents only by nightfall, he pressed on and entered an illuminated and gate-opened Carthage, where on September the 15th, with an enthusiastic popular welcome, by the way, occupying the royal palace, sitting himself upon Gelimer's throne, and consuming the victory feast, the fugitive king had confidently ordered prepared for his own return, while immediately initiating repairs to the city's largely neglected walls in anticipation of a counterstroke as well. Over the ensuing weeks, as Belisarius concentrated on strengthening Carthage's defenses, this shows how the broader Romano-Vandal interland was, after all, still dangerous. Gelimer consolidated, in fact, his surviving forces at Bulla Regia, distributing funds to secure local loyalty, dispatching urgent messages recalling Zazzo from Sardinia, where the latter had successfully reasserted Vandal authority and eliminated Gaudas in the meanwhile, right? And gradually accruing reinforcements from fugitives of Ad Decimum, together with contingents of Mauryan auxiliaries, though the majority of Berber tribes in Numidia and Byzacena dispatched embassies to Belisarius, instead, offering hostages and requesting traditional imperial insignia for them, right? Gilded silver staffs, crowns, white cloaks and tunics, and gilded boots, in exchange also for monetary subsidies, their allegiance remaining transparently opportunistic until the war's outcome became clear. In fact, as we've seen in the old video about the Battle of Mammes, at the end of the war, the Byzantines will fight against the Moors themselves, and also many Vandals were left to garrison the Berber frontier of Byzantine Africa. At this point, Zazzo's arrival with his intact army enabled Gelimer to take the offensive in December. The Vandals severed Carthage's primary aqueduct, attempted to interdict supplies, and infiltrated agents into the city in hopes of undermining loyalty, nearly succeeding in subverting the disgruntled Hunnic contingent that had been ferried to Africa against their will and feared permanent garrison duty. Belisarius countered these efforts through solemn oaths of rich rewards and repatriation after victory, combined with exemplary public impalements of detected traitors. Think this from a Hunnic perspective, want to come back to the steppes where you really belong. You don't like this place. And there is, in fact, in Procopius all the passages we've seen in the video about Tricamarum that sort of discusses this aspect. Having secured internal cohesion and completed wall repairs, Belisarius marched out in mid-December towards the fortified Vandal camp at Tricamarum, site of this sort of crushing second battle, where some 28 kilometers west of Carthage. As at Decimum, the Byzantine cavalry advanced ahead of the infantry, resulting in a purely cavalry engagement in which Belisarius' forces, despite being considerably outnumbered, held their most unreliable elements, the Huns and the Maori auxiliaries, in reserve. There is some debate, as I explained in the reconstruction of the battle, as to whether infantry would actually participate, whether this was probably just cavalry engagement. It is true that tendentially from this point onwards, especially the mid-6th century, cavalry would really be surpassing infantry in open field, but this doesn't mean that the sense infantry was simply left behind. There is a bit this prejudice. Aside from the fact that the Strategicon itself down the 6th century says literally about the Germans that they routinely dismounted as well, especially when they felt nervous because of sort of better horsemanship out there. The Vandals may have, as we've seen, absorbed also a bit more of steppe elements with the Alans in particular. As East Germans, they tended to have sort of better cavalry, but also measuring these things in an absolute objective measure is somehow difficult. But in any case, right, even from the Byzantine side, infantry actually played a very important role. There is no doubt that this looks like a very, very medieval battle already. if there is such a thing at all, like one. What matters, however, is this, in fact, head-on charge confrontation between forces that at this point are actually pretty unbalanced one another. John the Armenian's repeated and ferocious charges against the Vandal center, in fact, gradually eroded the formation, their formation. On the third assault, Zazo himself fell within clear sight of Gelimer, shattering Vandal morale and triggering a general collapse. This guy was a hero, had just quelled the Sardinian rebellion, etc. The routed army fled to its camp, which was soon overrun and plundered amid considerable Byzantine dispersal that once again exposed lingering disciplinary weaknesses and the command challenges Belisarius himself faced. You can imagine the Vandals at large. If you read Procopius, that is a bit biased, but let's say it's also relatable and probably sort of truthful regarding most of these incidents. The Germans, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths will not sort of look particularly apt, especially in terms of siege warfare, naval one. Here, in this case, like there isn't much of it because mostly land engagements and also relatively open plains, differently from, for example, the Apennine Peninsula. The Vandals, as we've seen, were skilled sailors to some level, but again, politics is key here. After Tricamarum, Gelimer escaped into the wilds of Numidia, which is not a good sign in any time in history in general. With a small retinue as organized resistance effectively ceased, the Vandals sustaining perhaps 800 fatalities in the battle, being enough for melting their force away. A Roman detachment under John the Armenian pursued the fugitive king for 5 continuous days and nights, nearly overtaking him before John himself perished in an accident. The morning halt allowed Gelimer temporary refuge, first at Hippo Regius and subsequently on Mount Papua among loyal Maori inhabitants. This was a sign of destiny of some sort. There was, after all, some sacred rule in that Germanic tradition. At this point, John the Armenian could not touch that and was struck along the way by divine hand. Belisarius dispatched 400 heralds, however, under Pharas to impose a tight blockade on the mountain stronghold. Pharas grew impatient, however, over the winter and launched a direct assault that was repulsed with the loss of a quarter of his men, which is a lot. But prolonged encirclement and acute privations eventually compelled Gelimer to negotiate surrender in March 534 after receiving firm guarantees of personal safety. The Moors were sort of more anthropologically exposed to hardships in the nightmarish environment in which they lived. The Vandals, what was left of them, could not sustain themselves equally in this scenario. It was also dangerous among these foreigners. Gelimer was escorted to Carthage at that point to reinforce also Byzantine display of power there. Belisarius personally secured Hippo Regius as well, recovering the royal treasure that had been loaded for flight to Spain there. The reason why others hadn't departed with the treasury already is that the latter had been retained in harbor by contrary winds, and ultimately the escort surrendered by Gelimer's secretary, Bonifatius. You see here also how the Vandal kings used, of course, Roman officials for their administrative tasks. Belisarius dispatched trust subordinates, by the way, to reassert imperial authority over Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearics, and in key coastal fortresses controlling the Straits of Gibraltar. So demanded the return of Lilybæum in western Sicily from the Ostrogoths, who had seized it during the war. They hadn't sit there. That they had, as we've seen, helped the Byzantines pass by in eastern Sicily, but sort of they thought that they could reinforce themselves to entrench themselves better from where they expected at that point, in fact, the Byzantines to invade. there is also the problem with the chronology, of the conquest or the reconquest of southern Spain, which was at some point believed to happen in the end, instead apparently happening between the sort of the Vandal, Ostrogothic wars, etc. But we will see this perhaps better in another video. The exchange of correspondence between Belisarius and the Ostrogoths regarding Lilybæum also inadvertently drew Justinian deeper into Italian affairs and foreshadowed the subsequent Gothic War. Still haven't made a video about that ever, but we're going to at some point. And the sense of this also being the autonomy, the liberty that Belisarius had at some point, as he would be removed from command in Italy, which also created a Gothic coming back after the first and de facto successful phase of the war. Justinian had all sort of master plan in mind in terms of ecumenic resurgence and so on, but these are faraway places. The Byzantines did not really even care so much about Italy. It's just like a Roman emperor has to reconquer Rome, point, right? And at this point, they did well as well. I mean, there is all a theory that says that this was an overstretch. No, it was actually fine. It was also much to reconquer in terms of latent fabric, as long as it was still alive. Possibly these exhausting campaigns triggered the same, provided at least with the fertile ground for the Justinian pandemic that sort of broke the reigns of late antiquity. I can say for good. We tend always to underestimate the continuity of this in the centuries, first centuries of the Middle Ages and beyond, like in Southern Europe in particular. In summer 534, Belisarius sailed for Constantinople with Gelimer. Large numbers of high-status Vandal captives soon formed into 5 elite cavalry regiments known as the Vandali Justiniani for service on the Persian frontier. So that's the fate of some of them. Others had been left, sort of the least relevant, had been left as garrisons on the Algerian frontier against the Berbers, plus the recovered royal treasure, including numerous objects looted, as we were recalling before, from Rome in 455, together with the imperial regalia and the menorah from the Second Temple for a triumph that marked the first granted to a private citizen in over 5 centuries and the first ever celebrated in Constantinople since its foundation. Gelimer, steadfastly refusing to renounce Arianism for patrician rank, accepted ample estates in Galatia, as well, a fair deal, in the Anatolian heartland. This shows, again, the capacity of the Byzantine to reassimilate these Germanic elements that, after all, were not basically, as we've seen here, fighting to the death or sort of putting up any significant resistance. They had softened and they were essentially now at the mercy of the same Roman reconquest. The reconquered province of Africa was promptly reorganized as a Praetorian prefecture under the capable Solomon, who combined civil and military authority and initiated the revival of traditional Roman administration, or at least its restoration. Also extensive fortification programs, such as city walls and rural forts whose remnants remain prominent archaeological figures to this day, and the classic provincial divisions, though effective imperial control initially extended little beyond the former Vandal heartland of Zeugitana, Byzacena, and Tripolitania. Amid immediate Berber risings and a widespread military mutiny in 536 that was eventually suppressed by Justinian's cousin Germanus. This part is important because there are people, again, that tend to make the point that this was an overstretch, that the Vandals would have been better left in standing, just enforcing their subjection. As we've seen, they went at war, actually. And their government failed, in any case. So the idea that this could be simply a Byzantine buffer state, especially Africa, the granary of the Italian peninsula, no, right? This is not realistic. The Byzantines did well to reconquer Africa. And even though there would be all these sort of usurpations, the same Heraclius that would become sort of the famous emperor later, was an usurper from at least he was not from Africa, but he was stationed there and took over Constantinople from there. Um, this place would have been better left more autonomous, would not reoccupied. Garrisons were too costly. There were all this. It was overly expensive in a sense. I personally think that the entire Reconquest made a lot of sense in the moment, and you can't say, oh well, but the plague arrived. Like, nobody could predict that, right? The Reconquest was an enormous success. There were some territories would be held for a long time across all these territories, and in any case, the sort of reinforcing a sense of imperial unity, of Mediterranean cohesion, etc. There was a further western world that wouldn't be fully reconquered. We don't even know, you see, if say one author does not talk specifically about this or that province far away, we will not know that much. There is an interesting historiography. We'll get a bit more in depth with this all, but again, for example, if you look at when the Arabs arrived, you realize that as far as Morocco, there was some sense of Romanity still living there in terms of administration of local government. So it's quite fascinating to see, again, the continuity. We always look at this period. Now, this video should have been about Vandal warfare, and it effectively is, but let's say it's difficult to and see how these predators, supposedly being the terrible conquerors that also sacked Rome and did this irreparable damage, actually were part of a much bigger system that did not die right away, that continued much longer than we think. And just for the record, by the way, Solomon returned in 539 and scored initial successes against the tribes of the Berber hinterland, also through the help of Vandal garrisons, but his death in battle at Chilium in 544 against a united Berber coalition prolonged severe instability, further compounded by the arrival of plague in 543. This is, by the way, in between the Gothic War was really big and devastating. Recurring mutinies until the general John Troglita finally broke organized resistance through a series of decisive campaigns culminating in 548 and firmly reestablishing lasting imperial authority across the interiors, or at least, province of that. It was a great deal of slaughter. In all this, the surviving Vandal population met the fate of many other Germanic peoples at some point were, like the same Ostrogoths, for example, reconquered, reassimilated by the empire. It's not that they disappeared. In a sense, yes, it was systematically dispersed and diminished. Adult males were frequently enslaved or stripped of property, which was restored also to prior Romano-African owners. Women often married victorious Byzantine soldiers, and the choicest warriors were either integrated into imperial regiments, as we've seen stationed on distant frontiers, or absorbed into the broader provincial population, effectively effacing their once distinct martial and social life. But we know that those frontier colonies, although akin to something like the Limitane that were finally melting away, sort of Justinian era, as a functional system, but that had been re-stiffened by the Vandal settlement of, in any case, like this more like B-series part-time militia elements, because the same Vandal society was stratified, where you had it's not much talking the serfs, we're talking the poorest, right? They weren't all like the knights, the oligarchs, whatever. The Alans, we know even less about them. But you can imagine all this sort of melange and the various vicissitudes, the stories of these individuals. Thus, the Vandal kingdom's century-long period of disruptive maritime hegemony over the Western Mediterranean, control of Africa's indispensable granaries and trade routes, yielded definitively to renewed and consolidated Byzantine governance, ending one of the most fascinating chapters, right, in Romano-Germanic history when you think about, the Vandal origins in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, the deeply ancestral sort of Germanic root of these peoples. Then there's mix with the Slavs, even the Celts, the Iranians, the Turks, they had received some of them. And this further blend in Roman Africa, it was in turn a blend of people. So it's difficult to make this history. There are lots of people that also connect. I don't know. There are lots of anecdotes connected with this because there is also an attempted reconstruction of the paths that the Vandals had followed, kind of traces they would have left. We've seen it also in the video about the islands, that there are some cities that are believed, for example, properly the hounds of these knights during the hunt, like that are the coat of arms, certain towns up to Portugal, right? Even the same Andalusia has been etymologically connected to the Vandals. There's a lot to it. Today's video was just to make a very brief resume of sort of Vandal warfare as a whole. Their maritime activities would be very interesting to investigate. There's a very interesting Romano-Germanic naval warfare that is more famous in the case of the Ostrogoths, also because they had obviously the most important portual bases, but that had been a thing before since the 3rd century and would continue. Also, the Longobards we see is the Byzantine Dromons at the end of the 6th century, the beginning of the 7th, in some sort of Italian port towns and so on. Like it's all a history that we haven't quite adequately told. Those, for example, ended up raiding Sardinia. And Sardinia had already been a nest of pirates, or at least a base for the Vandals to project their maritime. So it's deeply entwined. And one of the things I like the most about Schwerpunkt, how I structured it, is the fact that you can look at all this as a continuum. Like the more videos we make, the more all these stories are going to be entwined with one another, right? And it feels still too few. We made too few for this to actually happen. We must really make way more 5th, 6th, 7th century history, because there is a knot there. Obviously, this is valid for any century, but here, for example, today's video naturally is not fitting any century playlist because it starts from the origin. So unless it's across 2 centuries entirely as a chronological arc, I decided not to insert them. Let's say, but if you even just search for on the channel for the Vandals, I already made 3 videos about the Vandals. This is the 4th, naming the Vandals, and we're continuing and continuing and continuing. So this all will allow anyone to enter this sort of, but how was it really in a consequential fashion? Like if I want to look at or not the Ostrogoths, at the Visigoths, like what we're doing in the meanwhile. Well, you have all of this on Schwerpunkt. Here I made 6 videos about the Ostrogoths, too few by the way. How many videos about the 8 videos about the Visigoths? We have to make more about them too. So it's all again a matter of how you really wanna approach these topics, and I know that you somehow like them, so I'm going to make more and more. I realize that you follow a bit everything, especially if it is well presented. Thumbnails make miracles sometimes just to have you click there, but it's important to share as much as possible. There is really a problem on YouTube that all creators are experiencing, a debacle in views, revenues. Everything's going to change, especially in 2026 further. And last year was the last happy moment, and now we are properly in the darkness. We have no idea what's going on. So for today, in any case, I stop it here. We will cover naturally other Germanic military histories and Germanic people's military history. For today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.